Welcome everyone to the September session of the Woolf Post-Kantian Philosophy Seminar. The previous sessions that met monthly as well have all been recorded. Those are up on the Woolf YouTube site. So if you're interested in today's content, you'll want to go on there and check that out. And today's discussion is going to be recorded as well, so that will be made available online also. Our speaker today is Professor Stephen E. Lewis from Franciscan University, Steubenville. Professor Lewis is someone who may be familiar to you through a lot of the translation work he's done over the years in French phenomenology. He's translated Jean-Luc Marion extensively, a number of Marion titles, and also a title from Claude Romano and a title from Jean-Louis Chrétien. But today, he's going to be focusing on a different one of the French phenomenologists. That's Jean-Yves Lacoste. And his paper is entitled In the Footsteps of Henri de Lubac and Gregory of Nyssa, Jean-Yves Lacoste on Human Becoming, Historical and Eternal. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Stephen. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Stephen. I really appreciate being able to participate in this seminar series. It's really an honor, and it's great to be doing something with you. I appreciate you in particular very much. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen so that you can follow along, follow the paper if you would like. Jean-Yves Lacoste's La Phénoménalité de Dieu, 2008, published in English translation in 2018 as The Appearing of God, follows his Présence et Parousie from 2006 and precedes by a few years the publication of Être en danger from 2011. These three books contain a good deal of overlapping material and yet are in no way simply repetitive. Topics recognizably extend across the three books, but new angles of approach occur, and confrontations between themes that were treated in separate essays take place in other books within the same essay. This mobility of thought, where different recognizable pieces enter into new combinations, contributes significantly to the sense of intellectual adventure one experiences when reading Lacoste. By focusing attention here on three different related essays, one from each of the books I've named, I aim to give a convincing account of one of the important questions I believe Lacoste is developing and answering through this fairly recent work, namely, how Christian thinkers today, having taken into account the historical nature of existence, can best approach the mystery of the human being's status as capax Dei. So part one, Lacoste and de Lubac. To speak of the mystery of man as capax Dei is, in the context of Lacoste's philosophical and theological ambit, to evoke the name of Henri de Lubac and his scholarly labors, published during the 2 decades following the end of World War II, in which the Jesuit seeks to state accurately the Catholic tradition's best understanding of man's supernatural end. In 1995, Lacoste published a lengthy essay on Henri de Lubac and the import of this body of work, succinctly characterizing in his first paragraph the questions de Lubac faced and the answers that he illustrated and argued for. Quote, "Could God have created man without ordering him to the end described in Western theology as the beatific vision? Would such a hypothetical human have been capable, nevertheless, of some kind of beatitude? And does the exploration of this unreal possibility help us to think more clearly about what we actually are?" These three questions summarize the theory in reaction to which Henri de Lubac wrote his works on the supernatural and its mystery between 1947 and 1965, the theory of pure nature. Lubac's objections to it are distilled in the well-known theological proposition he defended and illustrated. Against the tendency of this theory to duplicate final ends, theology's only coherent defense of its intellectual project is a paradox, the assertion of a natural desire for the beatific vision, that is to say, a natural desire for a supernatural end. Lacoste argues in the essay that we will never understand what de Lubac's work has to say to us until we have measured what is truly at stake in the double eschaton brought about by the theory of pure nature. He then proceeds to lay out the consequences exemplified by key moments in the development of modern philosophy, from Hegel through Nietzsche to Heidegger, that he sees as having followed from the theoretical proposition of a pure nature and its hypothesis of this double eschaton. On the one hand, a natural or worldly provisional happiness, and on the other, a definitive beatific vision. Because Lacoste's discussion of the problematic nature of this double eschaton sets the stage for his subsequent efforts to think about man as capax Dei in the books I mentioned at the outset, it makes sense to begin by giving a brief sketch of Lacoste's dense, brilliant argument in the article on de Lubac. Two of the several points de Lubac makes in his 1947 article, Le mystère du surnaturel, are worth initially evoking here, because they guide Lacoste's claims about the eschatological consequences of the theory of pure nature. The first of these points states that when, in order to maintain the gratuity of the supernatural, the pure nature theorist posits a hypothetical human being created with a lesser, humbler destiny, that is, an end that lies short of the beatific vision, an end figured as a natural happiness that could be attained in this life without the aid of God's grace. The theorist is effectively imagining the existence of human beings that belong to another universe than ours, a universe completely distinct from the one in which historical, actually existing human beings live, move, and have their being. For, explains de Lubac, by posing a different order of things, at the same time one poses, whether one wants to or not, a different humanity, a different human being, and, if it can be said, a different self, a different me. The difference between the one and the other affects not only their individuality, but their very nature. This other being, what does he have to do with me? And what do I have to do with him? According to de Lubac, the theory of pure nature establishes a split between my historical self, me, and this abstract, posited human being. And it is this split that, for Jean-Yves Lacoste, figures acutely the modern reduction of the humanity of the human being, whose desire, through its hypothetical assignment to a humbler end, becomes truncated. The second related point of de Lubac's important for Lacoste's, the second related point of de Lubac that is important for Lacoste's thinking about man as capax Dei is that this division of man is connected to a sundering within the realm of knowledge, evidenced by the strict division of philosophy and theology into separate faculties, which de Lubac in a note identifies as one of the deepest roots of modern laicization. Following from these points, Lacoste in his essay essentially argues that the philosophical hypotheticals proposed by the pure nature theologians, according to which a posited man seeks his natural end in a posited universe in which God has decided not to give him the desire for beatitude, ceased in modern philosophy to be hypothetical. Using as his prime example Hegel, who is so central to modern thinking about man and history, Lacoste shows that within the horizon of the attainment of absolute knowledge, the hypothesized natural end of man alters to become an entirely this-worldly realized eschatology. In other words, against the backdrop of developments in modern philosophical anthropology exemplified by Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, Lacoste sees the human splitting effect of the theory of pure nature as unknowingly and unintentionally dovetailing with modernity's incessant downgrading of man's desire for an otherworldly union with God. The piously well-intentioned theologians, contemporaries of de Lubac, who, following on the thought of their scholastic forebears, promoted the anthropological and theological hypothesis of pure nature, unknowingly promoted a way of thinking that had driven, in the previous century, the most grandiose theological effort ever made, that of Hegel, to allow man to attain his ends in their entirety this side of death. In opening Catholic thought to the metaphysical possibility that man could be understood solely in terms of who he is now, as a being seeking an end conforming to the terms dictated by the present, and achievable through his own power, such theologians proposed a philosophical argument about the humanity of man that had already proved to be a gateway to nihilism. Lacoste's conclusion is sobering. And this is Lacoste. The conflict of the faculties of theology and philosophy, a reference to the environment in which the philosophical pure nature argument was created as a solution to theological questions about the supernatural. This conflict of the faculties was settled in anticipation. The anticipation was not matched by the reality, which was to see natural beatitude come to power in the form of absolute knowledge, surviving the era of the death of God under the guise of a Heideggerian serenity, Gelassenheit, to which all hope was foreign. It was also to see the theology faculty wholly marginalized, a guardian of the supernatural order with no purchase on the nature of things, above all on the nature of man. It is not foolish to say that God died because men ceased to hope, before he died of men's unbelief. Nor is it foolish to say that the faculty of theology carries a heavy weight of responsibility for the crisis of Christian hope. Okay, part 2, blending the historical and the eschatological. Fortunately, the heavy weight of this crisis of Christian hope has not left Lacoste feeling constrained to think in an exclusively diagnostic mode, ever fixed upon the identification and analysis of the ways in which philosophy has occluded the truth about man's capacity for God. No, Lacoste since 1995 has instead provocatively proposed several ways of thinking man's capacity for God that successfully honor man's created eschatological desire for union with the Lord beyond all worldly ends. Keeping in mind, then, Lacoste's attention to the damage done to the humanity of man consequent to the proposition of a double eschatology, we turn now to the previous mentioned string of related essays in which Lacoste grapples with the provisional and definitive divide and proposes the best way to think the former and surpass the latter. One region in which this divide especially appears is that of knowledge, where the distinction between intuitive and propositional knowledge correlates with the division between thinking about man in terms of worldly historical experiences on the one hand, and intellectual essences on the other. In the final chapter of The Appearing of God, entitled Resurrectio Carnis, Theological Study and Knowledge and Worship, a few pages from the end, during a discussion of the relation between the propositional and intuitive knowledge of God attained by man living within history, Lacoste notes that, quote, one of the clearest theological definitions of history is as the scene on which intuitive knowledge of God is upstaged by theology. He then asks, quote, is history no more than this? And suggests that we need to expose a prejudice in favor of drawing the line between history and eschatology as sharply as possible. Intuitive knowledge on the far side of the line, propositional knowledge on the near side, discursive speech on the near side, intuition and affection on the far side. History, after all, he writes, is the sphere of both knowing and feeling. And when the two forms of knowledge work together so that we feel and find words to tell someone else quite clearly what we feel, the distinction of the two separate categories is impossible. Within the context of this essay, the experience of worship, l'expérience de la liturgie, exemplifies this blending of the two kinds of knowledge. And within the larger context of Lacoste's thoughts, such blending of seemingly opposed modes of knowledge, of being, frequently operates dramatically in much of his writing. By dramatically, I mean just that. The argumentative plot structure, so to speak, of many of his essays follows this pattern. What heightens insight is the variation in the blending and what it suggests about developments in the thought. So in what follows, I will focus on specific moments in 3 different essays from the books I listed at the outset, in which Lacoste decides to introduce a theological and it's usually eschatological, concept into what up to that point has been a primarily philosophical development. In the three texts I've chosen, each focused in some way on temporality, the self, and knowledge, Lacoste resorts at particular moments to eschatological theological thinking that has to do either implicitly or explicitly with the notion of epektasis, as presented in the thought of the Cappadocian father, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, from the 4th century. In these essays, the non-static dynamic eschatology of Gregory serves to rescue, in a sense, temporal human processes by elevating or even glorifying them in their analogy to eternal ones. I hasten to add that the language of analogy, which I, not Lacoste, here introduce, perhaps draws too sharp a distinction between mortal and eternal life as Lacoste discusses them. In any case, these studies of human processes must have, it seems to me, an important impact on our resulting understanding of the human being as capax Dei. Present and future selves. And the first of the three essays is Lacoste's essay From Present Self to Future Self, chapter 8 in The Appearing of God. As the title indicates, this text addresses the temporality of experience and its implications for self-knowledge. The encounter between the discontinuity of experience and the continuing presence of something that calls itself I today, called itself I yesterday, and is thoroughly of the opinion that it is the same I yesterday and today, can, Lacoste points out, seem to change from something dramatic into something tragic when the stretch of time over which identity is to be established lengthens, and bodily breakdown, especially the loss of memory, confronts the I with its inability to match the self who perceived and the self who perceives. The classic solution to the problem of accounting for the continuity of self over time, writes Lacoste, is the concept of substance, what he calls a last word to be spoken essentially or metaphysically about what I am, supposedly buried below the surface, something underlying, a hypokaimenon or substantia. End of quote. Such substance, perpetually present, states Lacoste, prevents the stream of time from sweeping self away in its flood. While motives for holding to the metaphysical notion of substance are understandable, it seems to support, for instance, the common sense view that identity rather than difference is fundamental to the experience of memory. The reasons for rejecting it, writes Lacoste, are overwhelming. The self's history, which forms it throughout its existence, is left out of the concept of a metaphysical substantial self, which cannot exist in the world if it is to underlie the self's changes. The classical solution's failure to account adequately for the existential phenomena of the self leaves an emptiness wherein the lowest common denominator empirical self, with all of its discontinuities, appears as the only self worth attempting to know. This is, of course, unsatisfactory. The self of being in the world exists historically, and any concept of the self must take that historicity into account. The dead end of the empirical self leads Lacoste to describe the self in an Augustinian threefold relation to time characterized by distension. This description of the self is meant to make us recognize its fundamentally temporal structure. Always more than consciousness can get a purchase on, the distended self thus raises the question of the possibility of a recapitulation, what Lacoste calls the phenomenon that must come last of all and gather everything up, a moment of knowledge in which the self, in its perceiving and perceived modes, can see itself or be seen as one. Lacoste points out that recapitulation, anakephalaiosis, is an eschatological term signifying the final gathering up of creation under its single head, Christ. He reminds us that it is employed, for instance, by St. Paul to speak of God's plan in quote, the fullness of time to recapitulate all things in Christ, things in heaven and things on earth, unquote, Galatians 1:10. Echoing his essay on the Lubac, Lacoste points out that the concept has been used in philosophy by Hegel in his account of the arrival of absolute knowledge, while Heidegger's notion of anticipatory resoluteness seems aimed at, but falls just short of, achieving it. Nevertheless, in each case, these philosophical adaptations of recapitulation have been unsuccessful because, Lacoste says, each in its own way emphasizes a unique endpoint, absolute knowledge, or a settling for being towards death, that winds up rendering insignificant all the particular intricacies of continuity and discontinuity in existence. Lacoste's question now becomes how to tie substance to history without recourse to a metaphysical substance, and we arrive at a crisis point in the discussion. Is there a non-metaphysical substance? Lacoste eventually answers yes. He writes that the substantial reality of the self is that of its event, or rather history. But the problem is that we never view history within existence from a God's eye point of view. And thus we are forced to, quote, consider the hypothesis that there simply is no last word. Before death, the self is substantially itself by becoming itself, with no end to its becoming other than an empirical end, unquote. Lacoste writes that the quote, self could be fully known only under eschatological conditions, but we cannot attribute an eschatological character to any of our present experiences. In other words, Lacoste is demonstrating the alternative to the hypothetical proposition of the pure nature sort. At risk is the very possibility of self-realization within the mode of being in the world, existence, because self-realization requires certainty that there are such things as subject self, moi, and object self, soi, and such certainty seems out of reach. It is at this point of crisis that Lacoste declares, this is the moment to speak of eschatology, and to speak of it by employing its appropriate logos, which is that of theology. The question that arises here, I think, for most readers is what exactly necessitates Lacoste's resort to eschatology at this juncture in the argument? What exactly needs to be saved or rescued from endangerment in Heideggerian human existence? What is the nature of the threat? And what exactly is eschatology? Why exactly is eschatology appropriate for the mission? My sense from reading this essay in the light of the one on de Lubac is that what is under threat is acknowledgement of the ownmost validity of a self's history, what concretely constitutes each me. And the reason why each self's particular history is of value is because its itinerary of desire expresses and testifies to the human natural desire to see God. Again, the argument seems to be drawing on de Lubac. Lacoste is ultimately arguing that eschatology of the sort he resorts to in this essay is appropriate for this rescue mission precisely because it elevates the significance of the individual self's existential history, or perhaps the word is appropriate, even glorifies it as the possibly analogous image of an eternal history. But these answers to the questions I have raised become more convincing as the eschatology is laid out by Lacoste, and even then, only when careful attention is paid to how he says what he says. Lacoste proceeds by making clear that the eschaton he envisions is in no way a static one. It does not draw the curtains on historical existence and replace it with a fixed, traditional, angelic, eternal identity. It conceives an identity beyond being towards death, but does not conceive of that identity as a definite possession. Thus, it maintains the link between substance and being and becoming, thinking of substance as essentially open to a future. And that future is the eternal life where, writes Lacoste, the terms eternity, understood as life, and life, understood as knowledge of divine infinity, allow us to think of an absolute future as simply an eternal history. Thus, we see continuity of this eternally living self with the historically distended self of existence, insofar as a form of eternal movement is described in the eschaton. The eternally living self reaches or is drawn forward into divinity in a relation of eternal growth, to which the temporal self's becoming is analogous. The definitive being myself, writes Lacoste, like the provisional, has to be thought of as something that happens. He continues, here's a long but a good quote. Here, finally, the concept of recapitulation comes into its own. The language of resurrection of the flesh suggests that when man ceases from existence in order to be in the presence of God, nothing of what has been is lost. If our empirical end has no eschatological meaning or reality on the one hand, while we have no further reason to think of it as an absolute limit on the other, if it is possible, in fact, that we may survive our existence, the restraints of consciousness, understood in their widest sense, may quite possibly be left behind, together with being in the world. Post-existence could be an eternal happening. It could also be, and perhaps must be, a present that recapitulates whatever has fashioned its way of existing, a present at no risk of being disturbed by what it no longer is. What it is, we would have to say, is what it has been. I would then grasp my own continuity clearly. That was indubitably myself. From the many steps by which myself proceeded to an absolute future of eternal life, I could see how improbable it was they originated from a single design of my own and could infer a divine purpose. To speak of my own absolute future would be to speak of God's constant government of myself and my history. The true own-mostness of the eschatological self in its post-existence is described here as the result of this eternal happening. Self-recapitulation eliminates all care-weighted distension between past and future, instead revealing a single divine design. Indeed, Lacoste goes on to describe how the self, happening in its eternal history, might be understood as being in a state of constant divine recreation at an ever higher level in simultaneity with each new gift of divine life it receives. This moment in the essay is where we see Lacoste closely approximating Gregory of Nyssa's conception of eternal life in terms of epektasis, which Lacoste himself, at several points in his career, has characterized and defined in language that echoes strikingly with his own thought. In 1990, he calls epektasis the, quote, infinite transcendence of the soul toward God, unquote. In 1998, an eternal relation to God consisting of an eternal movement of the finite spirit toward God. And in 2009, an eschatology that does not freeze in an act of enjoyment, but gives itself to be thought as a perpetual beginning. The following passage remains eloquently, albeit implicitly, resonates eloquently, albeit implicitly, with Gregory's eschatology. Imagine an I consciousness, eternally present, eternally participating in the divine nunc stance, wholly at its own disposal from the moment it took leave of existence. And you imagine something that would contravene everything we can conceive of the relation of finite and infinite. The infinite cannot be given just so once and for all. It gives itself eternally. If in giving itself it simultaneously creates or recreates, il crée simultanément ou surcrée. I'll talk about that in a second, that use of surcréer, this creation of this verb. The recipient of its gift that must imply that the self never quits the mode of living and happening. So we must be bold enough to conceive the definitive experience not only as enjoyment of divine presence, but as continuing receptivity to the further presence of infinite to finite. The happening is endless, an infinite happening. But unlike the bad infinite of an interminable arithmetic series, the infinite gift is ipso facto a blessing. Le don infini est ipso facto beatifiant. Classical representations of paradise, such as Dante's, offer a hierarchical picture of the blessed enjoying the vision of God in proportion to merits acquired in their earthly lives. It can be said in their favor that they leave no room for frustration. Their problem is that they leave no room for the self to have an eternal history either. It is nonsense to combine the thought that each eschatological self is identified by a graded experience of divine infinity with the thought of its being drawn to the infinite by a desire born of lack. At some point in the pilgrimage or ecstasy that leads the self eschatologically to God, there is satisfaction of a desire, the natural desire to see God. But it is only satisfied in the mode of an eternal history. To see God adequately, we would have to see him beyond eternity. Long quotation, but again, really great one. The echoes of the central features of de Lubac's work on the supernatural as presented and analyzed by Lacoste are striking here. Notice the contravening of common conceptions. Dante's portrait of the afterlife is the example of the common conceptions of the relation of finite and infinite. What it means to speak of the natural desire to see God is utterly transformed if indeed the infinite gives itself eternally to human finitude, and in order to do so must recreate the finite self at an ever higher level in simultaneity with each satisfaction of the finite soul's desire, so as constantly to dilate the soul's capacity for both desire and enjoyment of the divine gifts. Indeed, it seems that what may ultimately be at stake in Lacoste's bringing this eschatological account of the self in its post-existence to bear on the phenomenological description of the self within time is precisely the claim that the substance of each individual self as desire-driven becoming or happening bears a natural dignity or even glory, as de Lubac argues. Lacoste writes, if there is room for such a self in an afterlife, we may agree that a resolution will have been found to the puzzle of the self that is never able to be itself wholly. The resolution Lacoste is speaking of here takes up de Lubac's theological argument that man is endowed with a natural desire for the supernatural beatific vision, and then completes it, so to speak, by joining the intellectual emphasis of de Lubac's sources with the affective and fleshed features of historical existence. As Lacoste argued in the closing pages of his 1995 essay on de Lubac, the restlessness of the heart hovers over and beyond philosophical distinctions that would disentangle the future of the body from that of the soul. Unquote. Human desire discovers its higher object in and through bodily existence. Reason and affection always work together in the quest of hoped-for union with God. When after this eschatological foray, Lacoste returns to the existing distended self in its, quote, being as a happening, he draws two conclusions that seem important for describing man's nature. The first is that because the self is a substance that becomes, the transcendental self, writes Lacoste, is not a natural way of being. Rather, it represents a paradoxical position we may assume for philosophical purposes. Put in terms that resonate with the article on de Lubac, modern philosophy ceases to think the humanity of the human being when it thinks from the perspective of the transcendental ego. Second, Lacoste makes the point that while ignorance has the last word and the I consciousness takes its place as a partial self-knowledge without a God's eye view on itself, myself nevertheless belongs to me. As he puts it, neither eschatologically nor historically can I give up being myself, which is to say, myself. This obviously follows from de Lubac and has ramifications for how one thinks of human nature and the relation between that nature and its supernatural destiny, because the individual self's itinerary of desire, the me, is central to its status as substance that becomes. Silent knowledge of the liturgy. What is interesting in the analysis of self-knowledge that we have just considered is that something that was discovered phenomenologically, namely the temporal nature of the self and of self-knowledge, was in a sense affirmed and confirmed in eschatological reflection. That the eschatological and the existentiel can interpenetrate is underscored by Lacoste himself when he states, "We think the definitive from within the provisional. Within history, we cannot but anticipate the definitive." There is blending, as we pointed out earlier. It seems that, for Lacoste, Gregory of Nyssa's eschatological thought lends itself particularly well to this two-way traffic, serving as an important antidote to the provisional thinking about man associated with Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger in the essay on de Lubac. We see this usefulness of St. Gregory's thought in the essay by Lacoste entitled Silent Knowledge from the Pre-Predicative to a Critique of Apophasis, which is chapter 5 in Présence et Parousie. In that text, the distinction between connaissance and savoir is a central concern, as it is, we have already noted, in several of the essays in The Appearing of God, where O'Donovan translates connaissance as intuitive knowledge and savoir as propositional knowledge. The distinction is particularly brought to bear on the knowledge of God and in relation to the use of apophatic language about God. Lacoste's primary claim in the essay is that God is incomprehensible but knowable, and that this holds important consequences for determining the value of apophatic discourse. Our focus here will be limited to the way Lacoste positions, this time explicitly, St. Gregory of Nyssa's eschatological account of the finite soul's knowledge of the infinite God in relation to human knowing as practiced in time, which is to say, within existence as being in the world. Lacoste begins the section of the essay under consideration by observing that, while the temporality of knowledge in the world makes it possible for knowing to seem complete due to recurrence of the same, to the extent that we can become bored, for instance, most of the time, instead, things we want or need to know, even when they reappear to us, take on a new or different guise that surprises us and even causes us to wonder. As a result, says Lacoste, even the familiar is capable of surprising us and making us aware that we seldom ever get beyond the point of beginning to know. This account of knowing, connaissance, as beginning or inchoate is the phenomenon that will be taken up in the eschatological thought Lacoste will advert to later in the essay. Knowing as beginning to know is especially evident when we seek to know God, because until death, finite man in the time of the world never moves beyond beginning to know the infinite God. And yet, says Lacoste, knowledge of God there is. It is knowledge as inchoation, a beginning, valid but incomplete. When we move into the theological realm, states Lacoste, this beginning knowledge is called faith, and it participates in the same dynamism that operates in eschatological beatitude. Lacoste writes, from the initial act of faith to the vision that causes eschatological beatitude, a single dynamism is at work, a same eros, a same desire to find in God its peace and its beatitude. And if for man there must be something beyond the time that leads him to his death, the style of that beyond can only be that of knowledge perpetually beginning and already begun. From Gregory of Nyssa and the powerful orchestrations of Jean Danielou, we have learned that an eternity fit to man's measure would be unthinkable if the desire for God were not constantly rekindled. Such an eternity must also be conceived as eternal inchoation. Nothing of what man knows of his God in the time of the world will pass away. No eternal life could put God at man's disposal. Thus the question is that of the knowledge to come. In order to give an answer, it is enough to put forth that the absolute future, however unrepresentable it may be, cannot be thought by using the concept of alterity alone. Lacking representations, a concept can here fill the function of a critical authority with regard to apophatic theories, the concept of the resurrection of the flesh. The concept of knowledge that I have been using in these pages is an integral concept, or a totalizing one, according to which it is the whole man as such, and not simply a faculty that he possesses, that responds to his gestures of knowledge. In other words, existence is knowledge. Unlike propositional knowledge, which can be transmitted as one transmits data, knowledge, connaissance, is always mine, or yours, or hers. And due to these relations, knowledge is a temporal and mortal process. As we saw initially in the first essay we discussed, from the appearing of God, that essay was, of course, on the self as substance that becomes. Here, too, the hoped-for eschatological vision elevates by eternalizing the beginning knowledge of temporal existing man, so that, driven by his desire for God, eternal existence, what in the appearing of God was termed post-existence, becomes an eternally beginning knowledge, signified by the figure of the resurrection of the flesh. Lacoste here connects with and fills out his brief discussion in the 1995 essay on the Lubac of desire and the resurrection of the body. The anticipation of this eschatological resurrected post-existence is given to existing man, says Lacoste, in liturgical experience. But because the logic of the liturgical relation to God's presence, is a logic of subversion that replaces death in a next to last position with regard to human existence, liturgical experience in its contradiction of world and death cannot be canceled out. Nevertheless, at the same time, we cannot deduce from such subversive experiences that they will necessarily be awarded promises of eternity. And yet, if by chance they are, writes Lacoste, quote, it must then be as clear as day that these must only be an eternal horizon to a knowledge of God, a knowledge that it would be absurd, aberrant, to assign a status of eternal transrealization in the eternal possession of divine infinity. Conceived in terms of the Christian formula of the resurrection of the flesh, the eschatological accomplishment of divine promises assumes an absolute future for the knowing body, the knowing affect, and the knowing intelligence. In short, for a knowing temporality. Coate knowing, figured by the resurrection of the flesh in this essay, operates as an existential concretion of the conception of the human self as eternally happening substance that we found in the appearing of God. In both cases, the eschatological figure treats a human dynamism in historical existence, beginning knowledge, connaissance commençante, or the substance of self as becoming, as anticipatory of, and perhaps participatory in, a dynamic that relates finite creature to infinite God eternally. Writing, Lacoste has devoted to the phenomenal description of temporal processes in human life that, when hypothetically realized eschatologically as an eternal process, yield insight into man's naturally pliable capacity for God. In conclusion, I want to suggest that Lacoste's meditation on this subject, for the time being at least, culminates in the essay La vie et l'esprit, which forms chapter 7 of his 2011 book Être en danger. While the role of human desire in realizing the capacity for God has in no way been overlooked by Lacoste in the studies of the self and of human knowledge that we have considered up to this point, in Être en danger, the phenomenon of desire takes center stage, and its dynamism is located directly at the root of both the temporality of the self and the issue of knowledge of the divine. this time approached through sacramental experience. Desire in this essay is described as a, quote, paradoxical phenomenon that introduces an infinite horizon into the finite, because it continues infinitely beyond every satisfaction. With the phenomenological description of desire offered here, Lacoste identifies what is probably the dynamic process at the heart of human life that possibly continues eschatologically as an eternal dynamic in the manner described by St. Gregory of Nyssa. In considering these essays of Lacoste's according to their chronological order, then, we see that in each instance, he has confronted a phenomenologically described worldly human process of becoming with St. Gregory of Nyssa's style of eschatology. First, that of the human effort to know God, in the essay on silent knowledge from Présence et Parousie. Then that of the effort to achieve self-knowledge, in the essay on the self in the appearing of God. And then, most recently, that of desire itself, in Être en danger. And with each argument, he has reached deeper into the human, investigating and describing phenomena in which, by virtue of the becoming that is central to each of them, the interlacing, entrelac, or blending, entremêlement, of finite and infinite within human experience is disclosed in ever simpler ways. In doing so, Lacoste, following in the steps of Henri de Lubac, provides a strikingly thorough phenomenological working through of what it means today to understand the human being as capax Dei. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. That was fantastic. Really wonderful introduction to the Lacoste, the thought of Lacoste, who is a really, really important phenomenological figure who I think only now is beginning to receive the attention that he's probably deserved for some time. One thing I failed to mention at the outset of today's seminar when I was introducing you and your work is there's going to be, I think on the 1st of October, edited volume on Lacoste's work that's appearing with Whip and Stock, which you have an essay in. And Lacoste himself has also written a new essay for that volume as well. The title of the volume is called God and Phenomenology, Thinking with Jean-Yves Lacoste. So for those of you who are here today and interested in what Stephen's had to say about Lacoste, I highly recommend that you check out that volume when it's made available. I have a number of questions I could ask. I want to get to as many as we can, but maybe before I ask some of the questions that came to my mind as you were reading, I want to see whether anybody in the audience has any questions or comments that they might want to make. So if anyone has something that they'd like to say, feel free to join in here as we kick off the discussion. No? Okay, that's fine. Everyone can think it through. I have some things to say. Let's see. So one of the texts that I was thinking you may have mentioned, which correct me if I'm wrong, you may not have mentioned, is Lacoste's experience in the absolute. The reason I was thinking of that text is one of the issues that you're dealing with in your paper is the theological debate that de Lubac intervenes in with this question of the status of the man's supposed natural desire for God. I was wondering, if you have something to say about how Lacoste handles that issue in a text like Experience in the Absolute. The reason why I mentioned that text is that ultimately Lacoste, if I understand you correctly, wants to say that there is a natural desire for the supernatural, that man naturally desires to know God. But in that text, when he's examining Hegel and Nietzsche and Heidegger, he's very careful in a way, I wouldn't say to qualify that position, but he's very hesitant to come out and just say it because I think he has certain reservations about how that view's been taken up by other theologians. So do you want to maybe say something more about how in a text like Experience in the Absolute, he's trying to work out this desire that at the same time he sort of admits is saddled with certain objections that he wants to avoid, maybe particularly with his reading of Heidegger. So For example, in that text, he says like, well, man as being in the world, in a way, can be satisfied with not knowing God. Do you want to say something about how Lacoste tries to work up this idea that there is a desire for God, insofar as at the same time he's happy to concede that for philosophers like Heidegger, man is just being in the world, and that death does have the last word?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to back up for a minute and appreciate the importance of Heidegger, like why Heidegger is important for so many of these French philosophers. And Lacoste in particular has said that, you know, we live in a Western society where there are, you know, countless people who are living a completely secular life without any concern for God, and they're satisfied with it. And Heidegger offers perhaps the best account of that. And you know, I think what he's, I think in engaging with Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and sort of seeing this genealogy that leads up to that position. I mean, in the essays I was discussing here, Lacoste is he's gone back to this important moment in you know, in the early post-war, where de Lubac is arguing within the context of Catholic theology for the reality of this natural desire for God. And then Lacoste is showing that what was put forward as a hypothesis, and like sort of like a you know, a game to try to clarify something in theology, how strangely it was taken over as a description of reality and of human life by these philosophers. And then so in a curious way, it's like these very, you know, kind of dry as dust scholastic or neo-scholastic thinkers, he's saying are like the ramifications of what they were doing by not being careful enough in always clarifying that, you know, this hypothesis is a hypothesis, and it's just a, you know, a tool for this particular usage, in the way in which it sort of got out of their control and fed into this development that then you find, you know, at the height of the accomplishment in Heidegger. It's yeah, it's like we really, in order to recover the reality of the human being, there's both this historical, philosophical, and theological work that needs to be done within philosophy and within theology, but there's also this phenomenological, I would say, existential analysis and description of just, you know, the experience of human selfhood, for instance, as he provides in some of what I was talking about. So yeah, I mean, when he's, I think when he's careful, when he's being careful, as you were bringing up, about putting forward as just obvious or something like that, the, you know, natural human desire for God. He's doing that because it isn't obvious to many people. It isn't, and it isn't because they're stupid or because they haven't thought through things, or it isn't because they don't have a powerful philosophy behind it if they wanted to read Heidegger, which is not, you know, not the yeah, so it's part of his respect for, I think, Heidegger as kind of naming our or giving a a useful analysis to our world.
Yeah, I mean, so
I don't
that
know the
leads me.
extent to which that answers everything, but
No, I mean, so that leads me at what was going to be a further question of mine is this question of why then, right? So phenomenologically, why is it that so many people may not be aware? I think it's the term you'd have to say aware of this desire for God that ultimately Lacoste is going to argue we do have. But before I ask that question, because I wanted to maybe pose that question in terms of another French phenomenologist that Lacoste is frequently in conversation with, namely Michel Henri. But because you've done a lot of translation work on Jean-Luc Marion, and Marion is someone who's very well known, probably better than Lacoste is currently, do you want to say something about this question of revelation in phenomenology? So one of the texts that you mentioned today was called The Appearing of God. So the idea of the appearing of God or God's presence, I mean, another way to put it is we're talking about revelation, that God is somehow being revealed to us. Do you want to say something about how Lacoste views revelation, about the liturgical experience, and what are some of the similarities or differences that you might see in his phenomenological presentation of being before God and someone like Marion's own conception of revelation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the first thing, one of the interesting things I feel like I've noticed in conversations about revelation that I've been present for recently at some conferences is for thinkers like Lacoste and Marion, there is just one revelation. It's not like God is constantly revealing himself in some new mode. And it's very clear in Marion's book, which the title of which we've translated as Revelation Comes from Elsewhere. That's the English title. But there's so much focus on the biblical content of Revelation. So and everything that he says there about how God reveals himself is rooted in scriptural interpretation. So there's a distinction for Marion between revelation with a little r and revelation with a big R. So when we're talking about like liturgy, and I think in particular, it's not just at least in what I was talking about with Lacoste at the end there, he's talking about sacramental liturgy. So that would all be, I mean, the understanding of sacramental liturgy and participation in sacramental worship is all under the reality of revelation with the big R, which is namely Jesus Christ, the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ, and the Trinity, the phenomenality of the Trinity as Marion talks about it. I think, I mean, it is possible that Lacoste is also at other moments talking about, O'Donovan uses the word worship to translate liturgie. And so it could be that in some essays or some contexts, he's talking about worship in a less precise sense of sacramental liturgy. But yeah, that's I guess one of the first things I would say. I think, I mean, I could say more, but maybe if you could refresh the question, I would.
Yeah, so no, I mean that's already a good start. I mean, so one of the things on my mind is this important distinction that emerges through the years in Marion's own work. This distinction, namely, as you've named it, between revelation lowercase r and revelation capital R. This distinction gets worked out, at least in one respect, for Marion through his really famous analysis of the saturated phenomenon. So revelation capital R is a saturated phenomenon. He calls it like the saturated phenomenon par excellence or something. But the key to the whole thing, as you mentioned, is in the forthcoming text that you guys have translated with Stephanie, is that revelation, he says, comes from elsewhere. So this is the mode of revealing for everything is lowercase r, revelation. It doesn't have to, as you say, just be the revelation of God. There's a sense in which Marion is interested in a phenomenal structure of, or kind of appearing, that he thinks is multiply instantiated by all kinds of different phenomena, not just what someone like Lacoste calls the appearing of God. But it's interesting, I think, that in Marion, this idea of revelation lowercase r provides, I think, a different way of maybe getting at what Lacoste is saying when he talks about liturgy as not being just related to liturgic, to sacramental worship, but something to do with what Lacoste calls the hermeneutics of desire. So when you're talking about desire in your paper today, I mean, like someone like Augustine, right, famously says in the Confessions that, well, we never rest till we rest in you, O Lord, right? So there's this idea of like the heart, right, the natural desire to find satisfaction in God and not being able to be satisfied with anything else besides that. And that's the interesting thing about Lacoste's position, is that in a way he's Augustinian in that respect. The way in which he's sort of trying to work out this phenomenological conception of the natural desire of God does involve this sort of hermeneutics of restlessness. But yet at the same time, you're right, he wants to try to respect the fact that there are people who haven't entered into liturgy, who may not be mindful of the presence of God, who would say, well, what are you talking about? So I think that's kind of what maybe the unique feature or strength of Lacoste's phenomenological approach, is that he's trying to kind of phenomenologically explicate why it is, from an existential perspective, you would ever get to this point where you end up drawing these theological conclusions that to, you know, a lot of people in our secular age, they might just seem to be completely unsubstantiated theses, right? Like, why would Lacoste ever think that? I think that's kind of the useful way in which he's approaching these questions.
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe say something about another thinker like Michel Henri, who's also had a lot to say about revelation? I mean, again, the reason I mention this is that if those in the audience have read any of Michel Henri's work, toward the end of Henri's life, he wrote a number of books about Christianity, including a book called I Am the Truth, towards a philosophy of Christianity. And then his final work, which was which was published right as he died, was called Words of Christ. And Lacoste has sort of always been in conversation with Henri. They were friends, they knew one another. And I think Lacoste respected Henri's work, but there were genuine disagreements between them. And I think one of the major disagreements between them, which is relevant to today, the material that you were delving into with Lacoste's analysis of desire, this question of revelation about how does God actually make himself manifest to us, is that for Henri, there's a sense in which those who don't know God have forgotten what it is to be a human being. So Henri has this view where the natural desire to know God is built into the very nature of what he calls life. So he thinks that you can't really help in a way but knowing God, because to be alive is to already know him, because to be alive is to be engendered in life. And so look, Henri offers this kind of account of the paradox is, well, how can it be that everybody is in a way a son of God, that everybody in a way does know that there's a God, but yet at the same time, so many people would claim not to know God, or in a way don't know God? That's the puzzle. I wonder, you know, for Lacoste, there's a similar kind of paradox, but it's a little bit different, because in a way he does have to admit ultimately, like, well, yeah, man is made in the image of God, and man does have this natural desire for God. And yet at the same time, he calls what he calls the initial or the provisional being in the world is man's condition is to somehow not know this. Do you want to say a little bit more about then what you think Lacoste wants to say in response to philosophers like Heidegger who think that is the last word, and what Lacoste would want to say to people who have sort of imbibed the Heideggerian spirit and may just think, well, this is just all theological mumbo jumbo. You know, when I think about myself and I think about my experience of time and I think about my death, I don't feel the presence of God. What do you think Lacoste would want to say in response to people who say those sorts of
Yeah,
things?
I mean, Lacoste is a very, very, very respectful. He's very respectful of other people, and if you've ever met him, he's a very quiet, and he has a very like sort of hidden, hidden sense of humor. I mean, the way he doesn't laugh like, openly. He kind of giggles a little bit, or and I think going back to what we said before, he kind of avoids arguments or ways of arguing that might seem to coerce agreement. I'm not saying that Henri is necessarily doing that, but it's so locked in, and the connection of life and God, that to disagree with it, you have to you really have to reject probably the entire philosophy of Henri. My sense, so in the paper at the end, I was looking at that part of Être en danger where he's talking about the coative aspect of knowledge, connaissance. So, and he says at a certain point, this beginning knowledge of sort of what's behind everything, what's holding everything together, he says within theological, when you move into a more theological and expressly God focused mode of thinking, it becomes the beginnings of faith. And I think so. It's he insists every intellectual operation has an affective component to it. So there, I mean, that might be something similar to what Henri is talking about, but it's definitely very Augustinian. I mean, you don't ever know something without loving it in some way. And so I would think that he's probably better understood as kind of in a more Augustinian line, in the sense of like, in the Confessions, like in book 10, this is a passage I've been really thinking about a lot lately, but in book 10, there's a moment where after Augustine has asserted and then proven to himself, and I think he thinks to everyone, that everyone is searching for happiness, la vita beata. He says that, and yet we know that the truth is often hated. So everybody wants to find a truth that will make them happy. But if someone comes along and tells you, hey, the truth you're claiming makes you happy is not the truth, come over here and tap into my truth, often there is hatred aimed toward that person. And this is then develops into the whole idea of veritate redargens, the idea of the truth as something that accuses as well as illuminates. And there's a whole inner, well, it's a conversion that has to take place, but it's one that involves feeling, and it's one that involves the intellect at the same time, to shift from I've chosen, I am holding on to this good, even though I have an inkling because of the witness of someone else that there might be a higher one, a better one, a more complete or capacious one. But that it's this process of struggle and of awareness of one's own sinfulness and limitations, of overcoming certain feelings of attachment to falsehood, things like that. I think I kind of see Lacoste more sort of in the trenches in that sense. He's interested in that, in various modes of describing that, with the backdrop of this awareness that a vast group of people are not initially even attracted to this way of talking. So
yeah, that's something Marion has said as well when he's quoting Pascal, but also Augustine. So I mean, with an eye maybe to rounding out the discussion, I want to say something, or have you say something about this really famous debate that's been going on for decades, which people in our circles in the French phenomenology world are probably getting tired of at this point almost, but it's important, it can't be ignored, which is this relationship, methodologically or otherwise, between between philosophy and theology, and how Lacoste fits into that debate and what he's doing. But before I ask you about that, I did want to ask, since you're a professor of English, and another important, I think, dimension of Lacoste's work here, and this comes out in this distinction between the two kinds of knowledge, which is in the French language, right? The importance of the word or language and conceptuality. And do you want to say something maybe generally about Lacoste and the things he's had to say about the role of language and concepts in human experience, and how that sort of I mean, he's written on like the poetic word and different kinds of words and different kinds of language and different kinds of conceptuality, and how this structures human knowledge. I wonder whether you just have any thoughts on your mind that you'd like to share about that dimension of Lacoste's work, and whether, or to what extent, that figures in here in his analysis of desire that you've outlined today.
Yeah, I feel like I'm not knowledgeable enough about some of his writing about language. I like one book that I know that deals with some of this, the Thèse sur le vrai, I haven't read yet. So yeah, I in the appearing of God, obviously the relation between philosophy and theology is something that he initially approaches through Kierkegaard, and I think part of why Kierkegaard is so appealing to him in those questions, and I mean he writes about Kierkegaard quite a bit, is precisely because of his style and his way of writing. I mean, Lacoste is a very careful writer, and like sort of compared to Marion, he he uses some of the language that's now common to many different French phenomenologists. I mean, like for instance, in some of what I was reading, the emphasis on the event and happening, but he doesn't develop the kind of intense wordplay, for instance, that you find in some passages of Marion, where you almost feel like we've departed from a really clear conceptual discussion of something, but you in fact haven't, but you feel like you're on the cusp of it. So yeah, Lacoste is a much more staid writer in that sense, and that's part of why he's so clear too, I think. But is it okay to address the theology philosophy?
Yeah, well, I mean, so before that, I think that would be my last question. So before you get to that, I want to just give another opportunity for anybody in the audience. I know like April from GCAS is here. If anybody has a question that they want to ask, now's the time, because Stephen's going to have to leave at the bottom of the hour anyway. So we're close to nearing the end. So if you do have a question, go ahead and ask it now, and otherwise we'll end on a note about what Lacoste is doing with this debate about the relationship between philosophy and theology. Why don't you go ahead and answer the big
Okay.
question? The big question
Okay.
about philosophy and theology, what Lacoste is up to with that.
Yeah. Well, just working from the material that I was addressing in the paper, essentially what he, in that essay from the appearing of God, Phénoménalité de Dieu, he looked for a problem in human life, namely this fact of our historical existence, and that our sense of ourself, is one that develops over time and is dependent on our memory and our experience of time. So it's historical, and yet some of the classic ways of understanding what the self is, what the I is, that philosophy has offered, don't, namely substance in this case, don't match up to the experience. And so as you could see in that essay, I mean, I think it's really exemplary in some ways of when it becomes proper to approach theology as a possible resource for a problem in experience, basically, that philosophy has not been adequate to answer. So in this case, everything he says about bringing the eschatological understanding of an eternally becoming or an eternally happening selfhood, and that's constantly being filled and expanded and dilated by God's gift. He's very clear about saying that I want to make this available both for people who have no faith as a possible tool for thinking past this problem, this human problem. But then it also, clearly ties in with, he has the quotation from Galatians on recapitulation, and it, he doesn't shrink from giving the reader a full sense of the theological payoff or meaning of that eschatological material that's sort of coming in to respond to the kind of failure of philosophy. So I would say, I mean, at least from that example, for Lacoste, theology is absolutely a resource in thought. It's more than just a resource in thought for those who have faith, but for those who don't, it's absolutely a resource that should not be shunned, because we have these problems in our understanding of just fundamental things, and philosophy needs help. It's kind of the kind of how I understand it.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think in particular the essay that you were drawing from the appearing of God, the essay on the continuity of self. I mean, that's a wonderful. It's incredibly dense and so rich, and just
Mhm.
a complicated, but I think very illuminating essay. I mean, it's the sort of thing that people who are working in the analytic tradition of philosophy have been puzzling over the problem of personal identity. I mean, they could learn a lot from reading that essay of Lacoste. It's a fantastic work, and so much of his work is. I want, honestly, if you can remind me, is the paper that you've given this morning, is that the same paper that's going to be appearing in the Lacoste volume that I mentioned, or is it? Okay,
It
all
is,
right,
yeah.
good. So
Yeah.
for those of you who want to revisit the text from today and think more on it and dig more deeply into it, that will be available in print next month. And I highly recommend checking that text out, because I think Lacoste he has an essay of his own in there as well, which will be, I think, worth reading. So yeah, why don't we conclude there then for today? I just thank you again for taking the time to be here, and it was fantastic to have you. And do you have any final thoughts that you want to offer before we conclude?
No, I just want to thank you also, and thank everybody that joined. So it's always wonderful to have an opportunity to speak about some of these things, and it really is such fascinating work, and it really deserves to have more people knowing about it and reading it. So it's a great opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you to Zach and everybody at Woolf for hosting this today. And as I mentioned, this was recorded, so this will be posted online later on. So it'll be there in perpetuity. So Professor Lewis, thank you again. It was good to see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, man. Have a good day.
You too.